When this information was given to the Secretary of the Navy in the 60s, they asked some very good questions. They turned a lot of his work over to scientists that were working in Bethesda, and they said, you're basically telling us that biology uses light to control things inside a cell. This is new information that we didn't really have a good handle on. So they said, is it possible that light could be causing certain things in our pilots? Could we test this? Could we test this hypothesis to see if this effect had long range? So in 1967, they funded a study that was done on the Blue Angels down in Pensacola, Florida. And through the avionics in the cockpit and also the light that was in the cockpit, Becker basically showed them that triglycerides, blood glucose, and insulin levels all went up in pilots who sat around that. So then the next question the military came up with, how many other effects were present biologically? And then the big question they asked him at that time, if light can control these things inside a cell, could we use light to control our new nuclear subs that were all over the world? Because we did not have a system that could do that, especially on the other side of the world. So the military then shared some interesting data with Becker that they were building this antenna called the Sanguine antenna in Wisconsin. This is now late 60s, early 70s. They had planned to put it specifically in Wisconsin at a certain height because they said that it would cover 7/8 of the Earth based on their physicist calculations to monitor nuclear subs all over. And their question was, would this antenna have biologic effects on the people around the antenna? And what would the effects be of the seamen that were in the submarines all over? So Becker then began to do this work for the military. And lo and behold, when he finished all this in 1973, he came up with one of those really thick, information packets for them. He was invited to Congress to give testimony, closed testimony. He did that. The Secretary of the Navy at this time now had switched and was very interested. They then hired Becker and funded him to do more studies on this area because they were very interested in it. And what Becker found from that point of time is that the military was a lot less interested in the biologic effects on light on the living system. Yet, all the papers that he gave them from 71 through 76 showed pretty amazing things. And when Becker was challenged with doing this, he had a gentleman in his lab who was a physicist, a biophysicist named Andrew Marino. Marino helped him do all of his experiments. One of the key experiments that were done in 74 and 75, this was after published papers had come out that showed that environmental EMF was linked to leukemias and lymphomas in children in buildings that were in Denver, Colorado. It was done by a scientist named Judy Wertheimer. Becker got very interested in this because he wondered what the effect would be on seamen and military personnel around these antenna arrays. So they began to do studies on this, and the effects were tremendous. So much so that Becker went out, hired Marino to do the work, and they had power lines where Becker's lab was in SUNY Syracuse. So they had just constructed in 1976 from New York City to Niagara Falls these 765 kilowatt towers, and Marino thought this was a good idea for the industrial military complex to see something that was local to his lab that they could test to see what the effect would be on the Earth's magnetosphere. And when they did the study in 76 and gave it to the military, they found that these small little power lines that went between New York City and Niagara Falls actually altered the Earth's magnetic sphere 80,000 kilometers above the surface. That was turned over to the government, And believe it or not, there's congressional testimony on this. You can see all this science laid out in excruciating detail because a lot of it, most of you will have a lot of difficulty finding the original papers because they've been removed by the industrial military complex. But Marino took such good records during this time, he actually went back and became a lawyer. So he was a lawyer and a biophysicist, got both degrees. And then he began to be called by the Congress about testimony about the biologic work that Becker had done. Becker became very, very frustrated with the people who paid for his research because he clearly found that light controlled and sculpts biology at a very fundamental level. He was now working out the methods that Albert St. Georgi talked about in his 41 talk, and why these things were exceedingly complex, and they were not the domain of biochemistry. They were not the domain of biology. Fundamentally, biology, according to what Becker's mindset was back in the 60s and 70s, biology is not a fundamental science. Physics is. And actually, everything in biology is solid state physics. That's kind of what Becker found. And that was shocking to him because remember, just like me, just like you, we all come through the centralized paradigm idea that biology isn't of itself a foundational science. And what happened from this point, you can read about in Marino's book called Going Somewhere. Becker became so frustrated with the military, who said they were going to do things that they never did. He went on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace in 1977 and basically reiterated the story that I just told you, how it started, how it went, all the things that he found. And of course, the people on 60 Minutes were stunned. Just so you guys know, Becker was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize by the Nobel Committee. 2 weeks after the interview on 60 Minutes, his lab was defunded. His career was effectively put on ice after that. It got so bad that Marino wound up having to leave. Where did he wind up going? He went to LSU Shreveport in the Department of Orthopedics because a lot of Becker's friends in the 70s and 80s were there. Dr. Marino just retired, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago. How did I become aware of him? I trained at LSU Neurosurgery in New Orleans. That's affiliated with the Shreveport program. 2 years before.
What's the military industrial motivation to quash this research? I don't totally follow that thread.
I mean, it should be pretty obvious to you. If you think about the timeline that I try to give you in the history, we were an industrial complex from the Civil War to about 1950. When the Bell Labs guys discovered the transistor, we decided to go from an industrial economy, basically get rid of the Rust Belt, send it off to Mexico and China, and we were going to build information technology. So everything was based around solid state physics and semiconduction. The last thing that the builders of the economy wanted to hear was that there was problems related to this paradigm that needed to be studied.
Like second order health effects, like dangers. I see.
And there was a lot of initial studies by the companies that were involved in this initially. That's Intel, Motorola, Qualcomm, who tried to bury a lot of this research because they did not want the information out. And this is way before the internet is, 2023. This is going on in the 1980s now, 1990s. It was all coalesced in the 1996 FCC law that Billy Tozan got pushed through Congress when basically he gave the semiconductor and technology companies legal immunity, just like we have in vaccines in that law. And most people don't understand how this story limits on. So my goal was really to explain to Huberman why he didn't understand the decentralized or the solid state physics part of the story, because basically 70 years of that was taken out of centralized science. Why? Because nobody got funded after Becker to do any of this research. If you try to do any of this research now, and believe it or not, to Huberman's credit, he actually told me that he's tried to get some funding to do some of this work because of, the issue with cephalopods and why they emit all this light, through their primitive brain. But he's found it extremely difficult to get funded that way. And the reason why is laid out in this story. Once you understand that Becker was the first scientist who actually started to get down to the brass tacks of what Albert St. Georgi warned us about with biochemistry, you begin to see that everything in biology actually is controlled by the photon. And it turns out that the photons that are most important are the ones that come from the sun, meaning 250 to about 760. Terrestrial light does go up to 3,100 nanometers. That does play a role, but from about 1,000 all the way up to 3,100, that's a water story. And since you told me you're a water guy, maybe we can pick that up at a later date. But